Serious, Redditors who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? I work at a graveyard, and I just have one thing to say. Plastic. Here in Norway, graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that the spots can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years, the body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone. Now back to plastic. Between the 50s and 80s it was common here to be buried in plastic, to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then, but once we started reusing graves in Norway we realized it is a curse. A lot of bodies are wrapped in plastic, and I've myself been part of what was supposed to be a burial at a reused site. The body was about 50 or 60 years old, and should be basically gone, but nope, it was not. The plastic wrap it was covered by kept the body from decomposing, and it's basically just been marinated in its own juices for 50-60 years. The smell was awful, the sight was even worse. I'm sure this is not the kind of story you wanted, but it's honestly the most horrific and bizarre thing I've ever been part of. Well, it kind of looked really human still, which was disturbing considering it was really old. You could see skin and hair etc., but it was a soggy mess and you could see fluids around the body like it was a person bathing. I don't usually deal with dead bodies, I'm a gardener and help decide which graves to reuse, so I ran off to puke pretty quickly, and didn't take care of the remains myself, but my colleagues cremated her with the plastic still wrapped around her. Nobody dared trying to take it off because of the smell and then the juices. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere pretty much and is surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket. And they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. My grandpa and the relative of the dead family put them into the back of the guy's truck. Drove them up to Kansas because that's where the rest of the family is buried. We thought it was weird, but wasn't really going to question him about it. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to embalming table we heard an audible click and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man and this event visibly shook him and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table I heard the click from that old radio and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. My grandfather told me a similar story. His uncle had died at home and this being the 30s, he was laid out at home. While his daughters were washing and dressing the body the radio came on. Note, Granddad used the terms wireless and gramophone pretty interchangeably to describe any music playing device. If he was around today he'd be calling iPods a wireless, but I'm pretty sure he meant a radio rather than a record player. His daughters were afraid to be accused of frivolity at such a somber time and turned it off but it came on again. Eventually, one just said, "You'd like some music while we help you get ready, Dad?" And they left it playing until it turned off of its own accord. It is in the US. A few years ago a group of teens broke into an old retired mausoleum. They trashed the place and stole a woman's skull. They caught the teens because they couldn't keep their mouths shut. The Historical Society took donations to repair the mausoleum since most of the descendants were passed on. The poor woman's skull was returned. A coworker in New Mexico, who belonged to the Zia tribe, told me that Native American grave robbing is very common. Beware if you ever buy some really high quality Indian jewelry. There's a very high probability that it was buried with its original owner. He, the coworker, told me that learned this when he bought some very fine moccasins and wore them to a powwow. One of the elders told him to take it off and look inside. There was a piece of leather on the bottom of the moccasins. It was the sole of the foot of the owner, who'd been buried with them. It is, and we, the Czech Republic, had cases where people broke into old German graves to pull golden teeth and steal golden rings off skeletons 100 years old. They counted on the fact that the Zudaten German community no longer exists, being removed to Germany after the World War II, so no one is going to notice abandoned graves being dug up. Spoiler alert, people still noticed. I worked in a cemetery. Pretty much all of the caskets we dealt with lock. At the foot end of the casket there would be a knob on each side. The one on the right, looking at the casket from the foot end, would lock the top of the casket. One time we had to open a casket as part of the woman's clothes stuck out of the seal. The dude from the funeral home had a special key to unlock the casket. Not to say that this is how all caskets are designed, but I would assume most are similar. I'm in the US by the way, so it may be different in other countries. It is if you live in Southeast Asia. In some place of China, there is still a custom that if a male family member died virgin, their family will get the body of a dead girl and bury it with the died male. To get the body that hire grave thieves to steal that with really high price. Or in some place of Vietnam, we have a custom of bury the some important belonging of the dead person necklace. Things that they used to use when they were alive. And some thieves actually dig up the grave to steal those and sell them as secondhand. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there.